Next up, Paul Rinaldo W4RI for the SDR update.
All right, good morning, everyone. Some people have asked me, what am I still doing here now that I'm retired? Well, I was an ARRL employee for 25 years, and I'm now doing some work on a consulting basis. Mainly, what I've been doing recently is ITU work, and this breaks down into a couple of categories. One is allocations. Now Tom, where's Tom? Tom talked about amateur satellite allocations. This is not the only thing that's going on. There's a lot of regulatory work in the background that supports allocations. Allocations happen about every 3 or 4 years, and they don't necessarily happen to us. For example, in work 2003, we were able to get the 7 megahertz band extended in regions 1 and 3 by 100 kilohertz. This last time, what we were able to get was 135.7 to 137.8 kilohertz. Next time around, we expect, we're working on a 500 kilohertz allocation. Now, this may not be exactly what we all want, but these are the things that we think we have some possibility of gaining. Not all amateur societies think of frequencies quite in the same way. For example, there are many countries where the amateurs are concerned mainly with DX. So HF, DX is what's important to them. Maybe to this group here, it's less important. And the VHF, UHF, and perhaps microwave become more important to support such things as packet. Okay, software-defined radio has been a hot topic for several years. It's gone from a purely conceptual phase into the experimental phase. Now it's drifting into the commodity phase where we are seeing some commercial hardware. We will sometime in the future see more mature commercial hardware that's lower in cost and down to the needs of the average amateur. We're also going to see some embedded SDR products. Now, I'm not going to talk about the development of SDR here because I think most of you in the room, or at least some of you in the room, know more about it than I do. What ARRL has been working on primarily is the allocations and also creating a friendly regulatory environment for amateur radio to survive. Now, within that, we work on a almost daily basis with the FCC and TIA State Department. Those are the troika that controls all the access to the ITU as far as we're concerned. Now, this is not the usual rule-making procedures that you may have seen and got all excited about. But this has to do with preparation for WRCs and preparation for the technical work that goes in the ITU. CTEL is something that maybe some of you haven't heard of. I think you've heard of CEPT more often, CEPT being the European Regional Organization. And CTEL is the regional organization for our part of the world here, the Americas. Now, this started out as a sleepy little group some years ago. It's been going on for as long as I've been around. And it's taken on greater importance now that the ITU WRCs, they're not accepting inputs or proposals directly from administrations these days. So in other words, if the U.S. proposed an allocation, the chairman's going to look to CTEL and say, do you back this? Is this your proposal? In fact, the U.S. probably won't make a proposal anymore without making it as a common proposal through CTEL. ARRL is supporting software-defined radios primarily through our magazines, QSD in a general sense, QEX in a technical sense. And Larry Wolfgang has pitched you all, and I recommend that you stop and see Larry before you go. If you're harboring some sort of an article, you can work with him. He's trying to make it easy for you. I see Ward Silver back there too. Maybe he can be some help from time to time. We also have an SDR working group. The purpose of this working group is to identify the technology and bring it to the ARRL Board of Directors so that they understand what's going on. They're pressured from many different angles of amateur radio, not necessarily the technical direction that they're focusing on. Technical Information Service, Ed Hare in the laboratory and his crew there, keep the web filled full of documentation of all sorts, including on SDR. Now, it may not seem to be too interesting at the moment, but several years ago, we were concerned about whether SDR was going to be legal in this country, or anyplace else for that matter. Some people in the regulatory world went ballistic and said, you mean that a radio can be put on any frequency just by putting some software in? Well, of course, our answer to that was that a hardware radio can also be put on any frequency that somebody designs into it. So there's basically no difference. So we were hoping that they would treat SDR the same as they do hardware radios. Mike Marcus, who was an FCC employee of the Office of Engineering Technology, had been worried about the FCC's report and order on software-defined radio. He thought it wasn't clear enough in some respects. One of them was the need for certification. Now, the FCC went to the trouble to point out that certification is not necessary for the amateur service and that they weren't going to put any new restrictions on us for SDR. Nevertheless, Mike knows the business and he was worried about it. Well, we did get some reassurance that the FCC declined to put any more regulations on SDR than they have on hardware radios. And the certification requirement went away. Now, when I was in Geneva, bear in mind, here's in some cases preparatory work for WRC, in other cases just writing recommendations. A couple of countries in the Middle East part of the world said that, you mean hams can change frequencies? Now, of course, they didn't know anything about amateur radio in particular, and amateur radio in their particular country was just barely tolerated. You've got to bear in mind that we have to trot our stuff out in front of people who don't know what we're talking about. And in this particular case, we had to tell them that hardware radios could also be built. And they say, no, they can't be built to operate on other frequencies because we have regulations against that. So that's a regulatory framework that we live in. In some cases, they can't imagine why anybody would want to build their own radio, or perhaps that they're able to, because the next thing is they have to have it certified by the government. So then have the installation inspected for proper earthing and things like that. So bear in mind that there are other groups out there thinking entirely different ways than we normally do. So we started working on a report. Now there are several different documents that the ITU comes up with. One of them is a recommendation, and that's a standard. So when you see that, that is something that countries are supposed to follow. A report is just a report. That is, it's information. This started out within the group that we deal with is Mobile Services, has been all along, and now it's been renamed to Terrestrial Services. And we have, it's called Study Group 5, is the whole group. Within that, there's Working Party 5A, which is where we live. So what we were able to do was to get a section put in this report which describes amateur radio, software-defined radio. Now, when I wrote that, I wrote it in there that we're dealing now with the third generation. I know that Gerald Youngblood described it as the second generation, but I think it's the third. If you look at some of the early work that's been done on little bitty boards, worked up into some useful design, still at more or less the board level, and now the third is full-blown commercial systems, not just the first iteration either. So we have that. That's available, and we can point to this to the other administrations and say, this is more or less a description of what amateur SDR is all about. Now, there is an agenda item, 1.19 for WARC 11, and that means WARC 2011. And it has 23 agenda items. This is not our primary agenda item, but it's one that we need to look at in sort of a defensive way. Most all of the services, radio services, that is, all the way from aircraft and ships and land mobile, amateur radio, you name it, are using some form of SDR these days. And so we don't want to be swept up in some mindless regulation that says we can't do whatever we think we can do now. Within the bureaucracy at ITU, what's happening is these different service groups are coming up with their own reports and requirements against this agenda item, and they're going to explain this more or less, put in all their requirements to one group. It's called Working Party 1B, has to do with spectrum policy. And they're trying to figure out the regulatory method of dealing with this. There may not be anything that may just blow up before the conference, and the conference may take simply note of the studies that have been done and do nothing about it. Or they could regulate it in some way. So we don't want to be swept up in that. Now, one of the things that they're fighting right now is a definition. You've all seen definitions of SDR, and that doesn't seem to worry them too much, but now CRS is the other one, Cognitive Radio Systems. This is bugging everybody, what that is, what difference it is. For some reason, this seems to be associated with using other people's spectrum. So they don't say that anyplace, but that's what's got them worried. The TV white space business has been in the news here for the last couple of years. There was a report just published just I guess within this last month or so, saying it's not a good idea to find white space between broadcast television coverage areas. Here's the guts of Resolution 956. Study whether there's a need for regulatory measures and to report these results to WRC 11. Now, the studies that are going to take place, the first one, the studies, ITU-R studies are actually underway now at the beginning of them. Then there's something called a conference preparatory meeting. This takes all the studies from the different groups, pulls them all together in one fat document, which may be 300-400 pages. They'll chop it back somehow, 200 some pages if they can. And this gives a little thumbnail sketch of each proposal or each agenda item, along with the possible options in satisfying that agenda item. In February of 2011, the CPM will meet, and then immediately after that, the countries will come in with their proposals, and the proposals will be run through the regional groups before they go to the conference. Then, if there are any recommendations that are hanging out there that haven't been approved by some other method, by correspondence, for example, then the Radio Communication Assembly will approve those last-minute recommendations, and then immediately following that, the WRC 11 will take the action on these studies, which may be nothing, but at least they feel they've studied it all, and that's all the work that needs to be done. I mentioned a little bit earlier, Study Group 5, we need to maintain a description of amateur SDR technology, as we have a little bit of it, a little section in that report that I mentioned. Study Group 1 is going to consolidate the studies, pull it together, and then there will be work by the regional bodies in preparing the actual proposals. I mentioned a little earlier that cognitive radio is considered something weird right now. It is supposed to be something that at least takes stock of its environment, that is situational awareness, and then on the basis that it does something. Well, that's where the definition breaks down. There is no definition that's been accepted internationally on cognitive radio. And it has to do with how scary it might be operating in other people's spectrum. How do you cover that? That is, maybe we'd like to operate in someone else's spectrum, but we wouldn't necessarily like them operating in our spectrum. And then eventually, there are people saying, well, we shouldn't have little bands anyway. Everybody should have some digital means of accessing the spectrum for whatever's optimum for their needs, and be able to blast through some digital fog and carry out their communication. The FCC has been working on the white space. They can't even define that. ITU can't define what is white space. These definitions in the ITU are considered the worst thing happening. It is easy enough to come up with terminology such as software-defined radio. Even that was a fight because SDR stands for something like drawing rights, something or other drawing rights in money business. So we now have established software-defined radio as a terminology that has to go into 5 other languages: French, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Arabic, for it to be an official terminology accepted by the ITU. Then the work has to go on to definitions, and the definitions will probably not come until the WRC itself. It's going to be worked on until then. And the sticking point, as I mentioned, is the cognitive radio one, not not the SDR too much. The FCC has been for months, or maybe the last year, I guess, testing his white space devices. They didn't work very well. In fact, I don't think they worked at all the first tests that were done at the lab. Now they've gone back for some more tests. I think some of them at least are working better, but I haven't seen a final report of how well they're doing, except that there has been studies saying this is not a good idea. The problem with this is you cannot tell what interference is going to go to a receiver. The receiver is the thing that makes the difference. If you don't hear anything and you transmit, how do you know that some receiver isn't, say, on a fringe area, TV fringe area, and getting this picture anyway, and now he's mad? Listen before transmit is often cited as a way of avoiding interference, but again, it's the interference to the receiver, not to the transmitter. So if there's a frequency being listened to for the outbreak of World War III, and you're firing up on that frequency, the World War III guys aren't going to like that a bit. Okay, where are we now? We hear complaints, I think, of almost all the technical groups, including AMSAT, this group, and some others saying the average ham can't afford all this stuff. They want something simple, want something that's affordable, that they can use. And I can see that this means that there's got to be choices made. If this gang here comes up with a SDR design that does everything, how do you know what the average operator is going to want until you get some experience with it? The other thing is we've heard that there's some work going on in multiple antennas for diversity in particular. Don't forget that in your designs. I think that one of the things we need to look out for is mostly hams these days live in communities where they can't put up big antennas. So if we can use multiple smaller antennas and somehow phase them up, we can help people out a lot. And that's my presentation. I'll take any questions.
I'm confused as to this white space device.
Okay, the idea here is if you look at a TV channel coverage, there's a channel 9 here, channel 9 someplace else. Usually they separate them by several hundred miles so they don't interfere with each other. And if you look in between those coverage areas, you find that there's nothing happening. You can't hear the station in Chicago, you can't hear the other station. But then again, there could be somebody with fringe area receiving capability that could get longer distance coverage from, say, WGN here. So there, in fact, I used to live in New Berlin, Illinois, and we had a fairly big antenna on our house. We were able to pick up Chicago and St. Louis, and that's like 200 miles. So it's beyond their coverage area. But the concept here is that in between those coverage areas, there must be some bandwidth that could be usable for some other purpose, such as for local area networks or Wi-Fi sort of thing, or that idea. So it's difficult to identify for sure where that white space really exists, and it's difficult to say what kind of transmission you can make in that white space without interfering with somebody's receiver.
I'm reminded of a guy that said during phone sweepstakes, white space, a clear channel is a frequency where the needle comes off the right-hand peg a little bit. One of the presentations that I went to recently was about cognitive radio, and the guy was talking about a lot of techniques that they were using, and I said this is something that HF operators have been doing for 100 years. Negotiating for a clear frequency, tuning back and forth, finding a place to go. I told him to listen to 40 meters during a digital contest, and he'd get some real good ideas. Do you know if there are any working groups that are actively collaborating at this time on a protocol by which these cognitive devices may negotiate either with themselves or with other stations for space on the band? Do you know if there's any kind of a higher level or made-up protocol that's being developed to identify what transmissions are present, what protocols they use, that sort of thing?
Well, I'm not aware of everything that's going on. There's been considerable DoD funding for software-defined radios over the years. And cognitive radio terminology, I think, originally came out of DARPA and into the FCC and elsewhere. So they have applications for it and some work that's going on. But I don't know definitively what's being developed in the way of protocols. Where we are, at least bureaucratically, is they're still trying to figure out what it is, what SDR or what CRS is.
Yeah, I had a question. I can understand how the FCC has the authority to regulate how we generate RF or receive RF in the United States. How does the ITU have the authority to determine how we generate or receive RF and the potential to put a stop to software-defined radio, or how we generate RF in general?
Okay. Allocations on a worldwide basis are made by the ITU. The FCC is a subset of the ITU regulations for the purpose of domestic U.S. Regulation. So in other words, if we get a band at 7 megahertz, the FCC then allocates it domestically to us here. The FCC has the authority to come up, produce a domestic band that could be not supported by the ITU, but it has no international status. In other words, if there's any interference caused by it, they have to shut it down. Is that?
Well, that defines the band, but not how the RF is generated.
Okay, well, the FCC tells us which emissions we can use, for example. Those emissions come out of the ITU. The emissions are defined by the ITU. The FCC is merely parroting those emissions. Now, the ITU doesn't necessarily restrict a particular emission, but bear in mind they're thinking in channel terms. So a SSB to them is an emission designator that's 2.8 or 2.7 kilohertz wide, J2E or J3E, and that's it. That's all they care about. And if you're given that frequency assignment by your country, that's all you can transmit on it. You can't do anything else. So all the other services have this problem of being stuck, given a frequency, a location where the stations can be, and being told which emission designators they can use. We're free of that stuff. Yes.
Okay, in response to the question about protocol for coordinating white space, I worked on that problem way back in 1990. I wrote a paper called MACA, Multiple Access by Collision Avoidance. Basically what happens is there's an exchange that takes place. When somebody wants to use a channel, they send out a request to send. And when the receiver gets that, he echoes back a clear to send, which has the side effect of holding off all the other transmitters and maybe on that channel. That addresses the problem you talked about, how do you protect receivers who you may not necessarily be able to hear the transmitter he's talking to. My idea was incorporated into Wi-Fi. There's a specific RTS, CTS setting that's in there. And it was also implicitly coordinated or implemented in all of the other control messages. Every control message in Wi-Fi has a little field that says, this is how long I expect to receive after I stop transmitting. And apparently it's been a very successful method. The problem is it does not work with passive receivers. For this to work, there has to be a protocol. Everybody has to be able to transmit. I don't see any solution to the problem of a passive receiver protecting those.
Thank you, Phil. Question there?
I understand the allocation of frequency and bandwidth and emission type. But the question of what the ITU cares about the generator still eludes me.
They don't.
What does it matter if I'm using a crystal?
They don't.
So why are they concerned about software-defined radio as long as the
They're not
emission?
so far.
Okay.
WRC 11 could change that, but the likely event is going to be that they're not going to restrict it. They're going to say, thank you very much for the studies. We don't see any harm in it.
Hi, this is
Hey,
BDL KB0G. I've given a bunch of talks about software-defined radio at things like open source conferences around the world, and several times I've had folks from that country's regulatory body in the audience, and I've had some interesting conversations with them afterwards. They don't actually care about the generator of an approved mode or an approved frequency band, but the notion of end users being able to reprogram the characteristics of radio scares the bejesus out of them. They understand that there's this thing called ham radio and that we build our own stuff, but they have this notion that we're somehow sort of off in a corner from a spectrum standpoint and not really in a potential not likely to cause harmful interference to others in engaging in our activities. But when they start to see broader adoption of this kind of idea, and people start, building things that are very malleable across frequency bands and operating modes, it's a fear, uncertainty, and doubt thing for the folks in the regulatory world. And so, the concern I would have is that if the way folks in these international regulatory bodies become educated about this isn't a good way, we could end up being the sort of unintended, having to deal with some unintended consequence of a well-meaning but poorly guided regulatory attempt.
Exactly. All right. Thank you very much.